evening. My name is Jay Height, and I'm here representing both Compassionate Ministry for U.S. and Canada, but also where I serve in residence at Shepherd Community. We're excited about these next few days and about hearing from God about the natural outpouring of our holiness, compassion. It was July 31st, 1982, and unfortunately many of you would think that that was something from the History Channel, but for me that was part of my life. And I left Middletown, Ohio to drive with a group of teenagers in an unair-conditioned van to Community of Hope. And it was there that God began to impart it to me a call to the city. And so it's my privilege tonight to introduce the man who had the vision to leave Washington First Church and reclaim our cities with the hope of Jesus Christ, Tom Nees. Tom has served the church in many ways, but in the modern era of our church, he has been the godfather of Compassionate Ministries. And in the 70s, Tom, when you left Washington First Church, you had no idea that compassion would be a need now in every facet of the church, rural, suburban, urban. For many of us, we've always thought of it as urban, but today, as the rapid growing parts of poverty, the fastest growing area of poverty in America is in the suburbs. The fastest growing area for hunger is in the rural communities. And there's one institution created by God that's present there, and that's the church. And we have the privilege to hear from Tom tonight, to hear his heart, to hear what God has spoken into him, and that he has lived out and trailblazed for many of us who've had the privilege to follow him as he followed Christ.
Thank you for the generous introduction, Jay. Seeing you and Dean Coles down there, I'm just reminded of so many stories that remember when Shepherd Community got started with Dean. If anybody could write a book about how not to do it, Dean probably could write that book. But amazingly, it worked. And I went there in the early years when it was just getting started, and I said, if it can happen here, it can happen anywhere. And Jay and Dean are the second generation in this modern iteration of Compassion Ministries in the Church of Nazarene. Great young men, and there are others following. We've been blessed with good leadership. And thank you, Dr. Leth, for your comments. When I saw the topic, the holy life and compassion, I thought, well, Dr. Leth is an incarnation of that theme. And if you know anything about his personal life, he is living it, the holy life and compassion. And thank you for being the leader you are, not only in the classroom, but in your life and ministry here on campus. Well, it is a privilege to be here and to be engaged in this topic as we are. It has been my life's work. And although I'm not directly involved institutionally, as I have been in the past, I still stay engaged. It is something that you don't set aside. It is your life's work, and you take it wherever you go. And I'm going to be somewhat personal with my part of my own story this evening. The purpose, and I hope by the time I'm finished, I've convinced you that you have a story too. And that it's vital that you know and live that story. But to also understand that we are all a part of a larger story that was begun and written before we came along, and it will continue after we're gone. But while we're here, we have the opportunity to write this chapter. I hope it is a story that God is writing through us. But unless we learn to know and to live and to tell our stories, there is not much of a future. So here we go. It's a journey inward story of a journey inward, a journey outward. And I'd like to suggest to you that theme of a new holiness story, of spirituality in a life of compassion. Let me just kind of repeat that, carefully worded that so that I can be sure I stay on the topic and communicate with you what's on my heart this evening. A journey inward, a journey outward as a theme of a new holiness story, of spirituality in a life of compassion. And so let me tell you a little bit about my life in the Wesleyan holiness tradition. Soon after graduation from Nazarene Theological Seminary, I served a congregation in Sunnyvale, California, about 50 miles down the peninsula from San Francisco. It was the 60s. I remember well those days of turmoil and violence. We were near the epicenter of the 60 protest movement. The anti-war hippies in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district. Across the bay, the free speech movement with Mario Savio in the Berkeley campus of the University of California. In 1963, I'll never forget where I was when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And in '68, when Martin Luther King was assassinated, and about 2 months later when Robert Kennedy was assassinated. Those were the 60s. And my post-seminary decade, the first decade out of seminary, was shaped by those events. I was troubled, as was Thomas Merton in his Meditations, Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, because my tradition frowned on social engagement. During that time, I came across a book by Elizabeth O'Connor, published in 1962, Call to Commitment. It's the story of the Ecumenical Church of the Savior, founded by Gordon Cosby, a U.S. Army chaplain who returned from World War II to start this fellowship in Washington, D.C. It was and is a church with Jesuit-like membership requirements, of spiritual exercises combined with engagement with the social problems of the city. I thought, when I read that book in Sunnyvale, California, had no idea I'd ever be in Washington, D.C. But I thought if I ever get there, that's what I want to see. And in fact, when my family did make a visit to Washington, D.C., I went to see the Church of the Savior before we went to the White House or the Washington Monument or anything else. I wanted to see that place, that building that inspired, that was a part of this ministry. Little could I have imagined that while watching neighborhoods engulfed in flames following the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, then in a short period of time, I would begin a ministry that would take 25 years of my life in what was known and remembered now as the Riot Corridor, Washington, D.C. By the time I began my pastoral ministry in Washington, D.C. First Church, Elizabeth O'Connor had written a second book, this one titled Journey Inward, Journey Outward. And it is the story of how the Church of the Savior reinvented itself. It had always been organized around spiritual disciplines, in mission groups they call them. But Cosby came to the conclusion that something is missing here. And because he had the authority to do it, he disorganized them all, said we're going to reorganize around mission groups that have both a journey inward and a journey outward. That is, we will continue with our spiritual disciplines, being serious about the inner life. But we will also engage with the world, and every mission group has got to have a mission in order to be recognized as a part of this larger fellowship. And so when I arrived in Washington, D.C., to pastor Washington First, immediately I went down to the Potter's House, which is their coffee house nearby, and I joined a mission group in which Gordon Cosby, the pastor, was a member. Now, our initial mission, and we would meet for a while in a mission group meeting, and prayer and Bible study, and then we would wait tables in the coffee house. That's what we did. We were waiting tables. First time I'd ever had that experience. It was worthwhile. We were doing our service project, but we began to be aware that surrounding us there was a crisis of low-income housing. And so in that group, we organized Jubilee Housing with the intent of acquiring deteriorating apartment buildings full of people, most of whom couldn't afford to pay rent, and organize those apartment buildings into low-income co-ops and help the people stabilize their lives in rehabilitated buildings. That was the mission of Jubilee Housing. Now, I worked alongside of Church of the Savior members with a few people who had come with me on 2 apartment buildings, and it was tough work. I'd never seen anything like that in my life. I lived a pretty sheltered life, really, until I got there. I'd never been around poor people, really. Not really poor people, at least where they were congested. I'd never been in a community that was poverty-stricken. And everything that went on in that community was defined by poverty. And I lived a pretty sheltered life in terms of diversity. I had no black people that I could talk to, let alone call friend. So here I am in the midst of a majority black city, and in that section, very poor, and had no idea where to go and how to begin. But one day, the Jubilee Housing folks said, the estate of a certain individual wants to give away an apartment building. Will you take it? Well, in a short period of time, with that small group of people that were part of the mission group, I found myself responsible, because we said yes, for a 48-unit apartment building full of people, most of whom were not paying or could not pay rent, in terrible condition, should have been condemned. We had no money, no resources, nothing to use to rehab the building, except this idea. And I walked into that building with fear and trembling. I drove around it for 6 weeks before I had the courage to get out of my car. Finally walked in, no lights in the hallways, just kind of feel your way along. Somebody said, if you want to know who the tenant kind of manager is, you go knock on that door. I knocked on that door. I introduced myself. I didn't want to say I'm the owner, but in effect I was. I mean, I was the one who was going to try to collect the rent and responsible for keeping the place in good shape. So I introduced myself. And a woman in that building, I'll never forget, Sheila Royster, she put her arms around me and she said, if you're here to help us, we're with you. Now, I went in and out of that building for 4 years before I ever had the courage to walk down the street to the next block. But that's where it began, in that mission group. At the same time, I was completing a DMin program at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. I'd begun to have a growing interest in my own tradition, particularly the 18th century English evangelical revival led by John and Charles Wesley and the founders of the Church of the Nazarene. And what I found changed my ministry, if not my life. The assassination of Martin Luther King was an Isaiah 6 experience for me. Woe is me. I'm an ugly man. passage. But going to do the academic work at Wesley Seminary was the Josiah experience. Finding within my own tradition the theological and practical foundation and motivation I needed to do what I was called to do. In the Wesleyana section of the Wesley Library, I discovered records of Wesley's engagement with the poor in his voluntary practice of poverty. All I knew from my theology classes in college and seminary were Wesley's sermons on holiness, taken out of context. We never discussed the context in which those sermons were preached, the streets, the people who were unwelcome in the churches of England at that time, who came out in the open air to hear Wesley and all the things he was doing. That Wesley organized a ministry in the city of London called the Foundry. It was really a hospitality center for destitute people. And whenever he was in London, Wesley stayed at the Foundry and said he felt closer to New Testament Christianity when he was at the Foundry than any place else he went. Encouraged from what I was learning about the Wesleyan holiness story, I eventually wrote my DMin project thesis on the topic, the holiness social ethic and Nazarene urban ministry. Now that was a long time ago, 1975. But I was encouraged recently in reading a new book, which I encourage you to find. It has a lot of stuff in it about Nazarenes, by Molly Worthen, who teaches church history at the University of North Carolina. And the book is Apostles of Reason, The Crisis of Authority in American Evangelicalism. I've got several books I'm going to be referring to here. I'll be glad to give you those resources afterwards if you want to ask for them. But from Molly Worthen's book, Apostles of Reason, is really worth your time. And she cites that, the reason I mentioned that, she cites that dissertation, among other things, from the Community of Hope in those days, and how she weaves that into her story is quite fascinating. Well, during the mid-70s, our small mission group became the nucleus of the Community of Hope. A ministry that, for us, integrated the personal and social dimensions of the gospel, if not holiness. We saw it for ourselves as an experiment. We really didn't know anybody else who was trying to do what we thought we ought to do. And we acknowledged it might not work. But there was a sense of calling among us, and we said, we're going to give it a try. And I began in those days to think of my tradition, the Wesleyan holiness tradition there, the story, in the words of O'Connor's book, Journey Inward, Journey Outward. And I've been thinking about that for years, this as a theme for the story that has influenced all of our lives. The committee reviewing my DMin thesis wanted me to demonstrate that Wesleyan holiness theology, as articulated by Wesley and later advanced by the founders of the Church of the Nazarene, is inextricably intertwined with social transformation. That was my topic. They held my feet to the fire on that. It was not enough that these leaders were engaged in serving the poor and advocating social reforms, which they were. The committee wanted to know in what way I could argue that holiness theology and practice necessarily, not just coincidentally, advances social as well as personal transformation. And so I read everything I could find, from social action and reforms advanced by Wesley in the 19th century American holiness movement, and the founders of the Church of Nazarene at the turn of the century. I spent weeks in Nazarene archives, reading every piece of information I could find from general assemblies and district assemblies to any kind of social action. And it was during that time that I read Mildred Bang's Winecoop's 1970 lectures at Tribeca, which was published in a small book, John Wesley, Christian Revolutionary. printed in 1970 before her major work, Theology of Love, in 1972. Unfortunately, John Wesley, Christian Revolutionary, is out of print, but I can give you the website where you can go to it and you can download it, the text, and I'm just grateful for headquarters for going to the trouble of making that publication available to us online. This is what she wrote. Wesley's doctrine, moreover, would not permit him to rest content in biblical theology as such, or religious experience as such, two stopping places for modern Wesleyanisms. Instead, it pushed him into the social and economic education problems in the world outside of his church. Wesley was one of the first advocates of popular education. He saw that his converts must be cared for, and he built schools wherever enough converts warranted it. He knew the value of wealth if properly used, but the curse of it if it was controlled by selfish hands. He practiced what he preached by giving away, we are told, 98% of his income. Labor problems and child labor came to his attention. He worked for fair wages, fair prices, honesty, healthy employment. He applied Christian ethics to a corrupt society. His voice against the liquor traffic, England's master curse, quote unquote, was potent. He was a powerful anti-slavery spokesman. Wesley's social reforms leaped the Atlantic Ocean and influenced American social morality more than is recognized. That's what I read from Mildred Bangs Wynkoop in 1970. So these were the formative events of my early life in this tradition, our tradition. The social unrest of the 60s, the severe poverty near my church in Washington, D.C., and readings in the Wesleyan holiness tradition. And it has led me to understand the practice of holiness as both an inward and outward journey. First, the inward journey. In the Wesleyan holiness tradition, the inner spiritual life is primary. There have been many misunderstandings of holiness among them, some of which Wynkoop tried to address in her book, Theology of Love. And there have been a lot of definitions of holiness developed during the 19th and 20th centuries, as documented by Mark Quanstrom in his book, A Century of Holiness, The Doctrine of Entire Sanctification, Church of the Nazarene, 1905 to 2004. The so-called cardinal doctrine of the Wesleyan holiness movement, and the Church of the Nazarene in particular, has been an intentional experience and practice of inner spirituality. We may have all sorts of differences about how we define sanctification or holiness, but what we will all agree on is it is a focus on the interior spiritual life of the believer. The holiness tradition has been intentional in all of its various developments about that importance of the inner spiritual life. Upon joining the Church of the Savior mission group, for the first time in my life, I became accountable to a spiritual director for spiritual practices similar to those in Wesley's Methodist classes and bands. I'd read about those classes and bands, and when I did, I wondered what it would be like. Well, I found out by taking on a spiritual director and being accountable for disciplines that have lived with me since. For Wesley, sanctification or holiness was more than a religious experience, although it was and is that. Much more than a doctrine, although it was and is that too. Holiness, as demonstrated by his life and his Methodist followers, was a practice of spiritual development, both inward and outward. The inward journey is both primary and complementary to the outward journey, and neither is complete without the other. So the inward journey, we understand it, define it differently, experience it differently, but this is a tradition in which the inward journey of intentional spirituality is primary. Agreed? The outward journey, and that's why we're here to some degree, both the inward and the outward in a sense. For Wesley and the founders of the Church of the Nazarene, holiness was the practice of spiritual disciplines and social transformation, including what we now refer to as compassionate ministries. Compassionate ministries has become so ubiquitous among us now, we might assume that it's always been here, but it was organized as recently as 1980 as such. Before that, there was no organization of compassionate ministries as we know it now. So it's relatively recent. Holiness as a practice, more than a doctrine or an experience. It is a practice, a way of living. It is a life of compassion defined by the Golden Rule, as described, among others, by Karen Armstrong in her book, 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life. The practice of holiness or sanctification is a journey to and with God. God is known to us in our practices of contemplation, prayer, and silence. And, as Mother Teresa said, Jesus comes to us in the distressing disguise of the poor. Just as those of the Wesleyan holiness persuasion have always been intentional about personal transformation, so at their best, they, or we, have always been about social transformation. In his book, Discovering an Evangelical Heritage, in 1976, Donald Dayton documented the wide range of social reform movements in the 19th century advanced by holiness and other evangelical groups. But Dayton also described the demise of those social reform movements in the mid-20th century. In Apostles of Reason, Worthen notes that Timothy Smith's Revivalism and Social Reform, 1957 book, traced the roots of 19th century social progressivism, normally associated with liberal Protestant theology, to earlier evangelical revivals. I often found that, even in doing some of the academic work, particularly with those who were setting up evangelical social action or holy social action over against the social gospel. But if you read in the documents of the formative period of the Church of the Nazarene, many of the things that our Nazarene forebears were passionate about were the same things that were the causes championed by the social gospel movement. There wasn't that much difference when it came to recognizing needs and how to oppose them. There was a big difference in how they understood evangelism and personal salvation, but the issues were the same on both sides, and that was really Timothy Smith's thesis in revivalism and social reform. I mention all of this because I think we need to remember the mid-20th century Wesleyan holiness narrative to understand where we are now and where I think we need to go. The approximate 50 years, 1925 to 1975, was a period Timothy Smith referred to as the Great Reversal, when holiness, social action, and reform were nearly forgotten. And David O. Moberg, professor of sociology and anthropology at Marquette University, used that phrase from Timothy Smith for the title of his 1972 book, The Great Reversal, Evangelism versus Social Concern, to describe how Wesleyans, among others, gave up their social concern in reaction to the social gospel. I discovered this in my research in the archives of Nazarene documents. Before 1925, the General Assemblies, the district assemblies, had committees that were looking out for a variety of ministries, inner-city missions, orphanages, rest cottages as they're referred to. Every district, General Assemblies had reports on all these things. And in 1925, it's like a switch was turned off. And they all disappeared almost overnight. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that I won't get into here. But you can see in the history of our own denomination how it changed so quickly. Fundamentalism, with its opposition to any social action that resembled the social gospel, influenced evangelicals generally, including the holiness churches, including our own fellowship. Fortunately, it began to change in 1970, in the 70s at least. At least it began to change. Because I believe we have still not arrived at an understanding of holiness as the integration of personal and social dimensions of the Gospels as practiced by our founders. I think Wesley and Brazee would find our emphasis on compassion and ministry very curious. You see, everything the Wesleys did was the integration of the inward and the outward, spiritual disciplines and engagement with the world. As you wouldn't have a department of holiness necessarily, because that's who we are. You wouldn't organize a department of compassion ministries as one more activity alongside everything else you're doing, because that's what we do. Every church, every individual. That's who we are. Why would you have a department or a compassionate ministries organization to do what everybody's doing? The fact that we have organized compassion ministries is an indication to me that we have a long way to go before compassion ministry becomes the life and heartbeat of every congregation and every individual, as it was with Wesley and as it was with Brazee. Can you imagine Brazee in Los Angeles, starting the Los Angeles mission as the first church of the Nazarene on the West Coast, organizing compassion ministries? Well, they did that every day, every Sunday. It was always this integration of the inner life and the engagement with the world that described this fellowship. Now, that's not a speech against compassion ministry, Jay. But I know we've talked about this often enough to understand the challenge before us. Because the organization of compassion ministries, and I can tell you about that, is an attempt to get back what we lost. And it's in a way, it's giving us some direction of where we need to go. Well, I think, interestingly enough, Bulwer wrote another book 5 years later, same title, Revision, The Great Reversal, but he changed the subtitle from Evangelism versus Social Concern to Evangelism and Social Concern, because he recognized in the 70s something was changing. And evangelical and holiness churches were rediscovering their roots and coming back to that movement that started them in the first place. And so, as he wrote, the great reversal is beginning to be reversed. And that was the topic of that revision book. I think that to get where we need to be, we need a new story. We need another way in this time, in this age, of telling our story and living our story. The idea of putting it this way came to me recently as a result of the meeting I joined with Abdul Aziz Saeed after reading his book, Islam and Peacemaking in the Middle East. Saeed is a Christian Syrian, been teaching international relationships and global peace at American University since 1957. Senior ranking professor at American University. The second chapter of his book, Islam and Peacemaking in the Middle East, is the need for a new story. Said writes that Middle East peace will come only when the confrontational stories of the past are replaced with compatibility stories for the present and future. I suggest to you that the phrase journey inward, journey outward could be a theme of a new holiness compatibility story of spirituality in a life of compassion. In this story, we would recognize that holiness is a practice of both inner spirituality and a compassionate life. We would recognize that the inward journey of holiness might take many routes, regardless of where it began. We would be willing to let go of our confrontation stories with their legalisms and exclusive claims to truth. We would reject the confrontation story of fundamentalism. As Professor Said writes, fundamentalism implies a refusal to listen to the other. We would recognize that holiness is a practice of compassion, leading us outward to a world of suffering and human need. In our compatibility story, we would respond to human suffering wherever it exists and cease our disputes about the social gospel and social justice. We would recognize that evangelism, sharing the good news, is always compassionate, and that Christian compassion is good news or evangelism. The new holiness compatibility story is, to coin a phrase, compassion evangelism. I think this theme, this new story, will be well received beyond the boundaries of our own tribe. Evidently, the increasing number of nuns, N-O-N-E-S, those claiming no religious affiliation, is not a reaction to spirituality and compassion. But those who are leaving us are just fed up with the old stories of religious disputes, contentious true believers, and indifference to a world of need. I think we can connect with the nuns by telling the new holiness story as an intentional journey of spirituality and compassion. With this new story, we can retain and attract the next generation as we recover and are faithful to our own tradition. As in the subtitle of a book that I had for a couple of years by Jonah Sachs, the title of the book is Winning the Story Wars. Subtitle, Those Who Tell and Live the Best Stories Will Rule the Future. I was tempted tonight just to come and tell stories about people that I've seen in my lifetime, whose lives have been transformed as a result of coming in contact with a person who's living the life of compassion. Let me tell you just one. She's passed on to her reward now. But about 20 years ago, I was invited to go up to Boston, doing a tour of Compassion Ministry, and meet a woman, Esther Sanger. Esther was a little short woman. I mean, when I rode around with her, she was so short she could hardly see above the steering wheel. Hardly touched the floorboard or the gas pedal when we drove all around. She was a foster child taken in by Professor Bertha Monroe at Eastern Nazarene College. It was through Bertha Monroe that she got introduced to a good education at ENC and became a nurse. I was there to see what she was doing in what we call a compassionate ministry. And what I discovered, she had a house about a block away from the campus. And she'd rebuilt the garage in the backyard of this house into a pustynia, a Russian word for a place of spiritual retreat. So you'd taken that garage and completely rehabbed it. So it was it had an altar and a place of prayer and all of the books and encouragements of spirituality in her backyard. And Esther Sanger would go to her pustynia to pray, to be in silence, and to read the scriptures. The basement of her house she had turned into a food bank. And she was soliciting neighbors and friends and campus to bring food. And she had students from the college working with her. And she discovered that a lot of the homeless people nearby in Quincy, Mass. Were hanging out, kind of living their days out in a nearby cemetery. So Esther Sanger would gather up the groceries and she would get the students and head down to the cemetery with the food for the homeless people in the cemetery. She went on beyond that and she organized something called the Quincy Crisis Center, and then the Mary Martha Learning Center for women and children who were homeless. I watched her, and I drove around the city with her, and I was curious, what is it that calls you, that drives you to this ministry? And she talked about her troubled childhood and the difficulties that she had growing up, and how Bertha Monroe came alongside of her and nurtured her spiritually, and how her eyes were open to the needs of the world in her own neighborhood. One thing led to another. And as I think back on that, what I'm thinking is that Esther Sanger discovered her story. She discovered why she's here. She began to understand that it's not just Jesus and me. That kind of religion wasn't about to suit her. It had to be a life lived, a life of compassion lived outwardly, but nurtured by a disciplined inner life of prayer and contemplation, sometimes silence, in order to have the strength and the motivation to do what she's called to do. You see, we all have been born into a story. Most of us at least. Maybe some of you from outside the tradition. But if you're like me, we've been born into this Wesleyan holiness story. It was passed on to us. We had nothing to do with its origins. And it will go on after we pass on. But right now, in this moment, we have the opportunity to rewrite the story, or at least a new chapter to the story that God is writing through us. What is your story? Compassion ministry isn't about necessarily a community of hope or shepherd community or these organizations that we're in. It's about each one of us understanding holiness not simply as an experience or a doctrine, but essentially as a practice. The practice of holiness in inward spirituality, in outward engagement with the world. That's who we are. That's what we have to bring to the world. I'd like to be a part of a new creative story of compatibility, as Professor Saeed put it. We put aside the differences that are real in order to advance a story that will not only attract but retain those of us who are part of this story. Well, you know the song. It's the chorus of Blessed Assurance. This is my story. This is my song. Do I have time for one more story? Community of Hope, we had a little gospel choir. It was a ragged group. These people would all come off the street. They were all what I call my resurrection stories. I use resurrection because the language of conversion and so forth wasn't strong enough to explain the transformation that I saw in the lives of people who were really the zombies, dead, the walking dead that had come back to life. And so we had this little gospel choir. We'd go out and sing in churches, and before we would do our concerts, we'd sit down for a minute of prayer and reflection and say, who's going to tell their story tonight? And someone would volunteer, or someone would be volunteered. Willie Murphy, and he's still a member of that Community of Hope church. Never forget his story. He was sitting on the front of the Community of Hope one day, and somebody came by and shot him. Meant to shoot him between the eyes, but Murph ducked, and the bullet went in the side of his neck, and it's still there. So when he'd tell his story, he'd lean over and say, see that? Murph was a Vietnam vet, homeless. He used to come into our chapel drunk during the day and sleep off his drunk. He knew who I was. I'd have to shake him at the end of the day when we were ready to close the doors and say, Murph, it's time to go. He'd get up and go, and the next day he'd be back again. One day he came to me, he said, Rev, that's what he called me. He said, I'm a Christian. I said, Murph, I'm the one who decides who's a Christian, you know. Well, something like that. We hadn't talked about that, but something had happened. And Murph would get up and tell his story about how he came to find faith and how his life was transformed. And, we were in churches that hadn't seen a before and after story in years. And they get so excited about these stories of transformation, the resurrection stories. But after one of those concerts, we'd stopped along the road before our 2-hour trip back to Washington, D.C. And I could tell there was something not quite right. And I pushed a little, we don't want to talk. And I kept pushing and said, well, all right, this is what we've been talking about. He said, you always set these concerts up and you encourage us to tell our stories, but you never tell your story. Don't you have a story? And I realized at that moment that I'd been intimidated by the stories that other people told, these before and after stories. I was raised in very privileged environments. I didn't have a story like that. But I had to go back and get in touch with my own story and learn to tell the story not in terms of what may have happened or not happened in the past, but in terms of what God is doing with my life at this moment. That's my story. This is my story. And in the lines of Jonah Sachs, those who tell, and I would add to begin, those who know and tell and live the best stories will rule the world.